She heard rustling above her head and thought it was mice. The dog barked at night. The children cried, but no one believed her. Until one day, her mother decided to open the attic. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. Maria had long since stopped believing in the illusion of rest. Her days bled into one another, with the quiet exhaustion of someone who carried the weight of too many responsibilities on shoulders that never felt strong enough. She lived in an aging house on the edge of town, a structure that had once been passed down through her ex-husband's family, though to her it had never felt like a gift. The wooden beams groaned in the evenings, as if the house itself complained of being neglected. And every corner bore the scars of time, peeling paint, cracks running like veins across the plaster, a roof that surrendered rainwater through a dozen small leaks. The place required attention she had neither the money nor the energy to give. Yet it was all she had, and so she held on to it, with the stubborn determination of someone who understood that letting go would mean losing everything. Her children were her reason for enduring the daily struggle. Thomas, 12 years old, had already begun to develop the guardedness of a boy who had seen too much of life's weight too early. He wanted to help, carrying buckets of water when the pipes gave out, holding the flashlight when Maria tried her hand at simple repairs, always watching her with a quiet protectiveness that she both cherished and feared. He was growing up too fast, forced to take on a role no child should shoulder. Lillian, just 7, lived in a different world. She drew pictures of castles, kittens, and sunshine, decorating the refrigerator door with sketches that filled the dim kitchen with a fragile hope. She clung to her innocence with a resilience that made Maria ache, for she knew that life, sooner or later, would pull it from her. The only constant presence who asked nothing but gave everything was Rex, their German shepherd. He had come into their lives as a gift from a friend after the divorce. When Maria was drowning in loneliness, she never admitted to anyone. Rex became more than a dog. He was a sentinel, a steady heart that kept vigil over her family. He lay by the children's beds at night, pacing when they cried in their sleep, barking furiously if a stranger walked too close to the yard. For Maria, he was both shield and comfort, proof that even when her world seemed unsteady, there was still one creature who would never abandon them. It began with the smallest disturbances. A faint scuffle above the ceiling while Maria folded laundry at night. A tapping noise when she sat alone in the living room, trying to balance the checkbook. The faint scrape of something shifting on wood. She dismissed it quickly, telling herself that an old house would always have its quirks. Mice, perhaps, or squirrels squeezing through the cracks in the eaves. She was not naive. She knew that vermin found ways into warm attics, and she had resigned herself to living with more imperfections than she could mend. But as the weeks passed, the noises grew bolder. What had once sounded like the light patter of small paws turned heavier, dragging as though something larger shifted its weight across the beams. Rex noticed before anyone else. At first his ears perked up, his head turning toward the ceiling whenever the strange noises started. Soon, his vigilance turned restless. He barked in the middle of the night, sharp warning cries that jolted Maria upright in bed, her heart racing. He planted himself at the bottom of the ladder leading to the attic, growling, scraping at the door, as if demanding to be let through. His agitation unsettled her more than the sounds themselves. Dogs sensed things humans could not, and yet she clung to denial because accepting his warning meant confronting another problem she was not ready to face. The children began to sense it too. One morning, Thomas admitted in a whisper that he had heard something strange during the night. Not just a scuffle, but a hiss, a long, low sound that made his skin crawl. Maria tried to laugh it off, to suggest that it might have been the wind sneaking through a crack, but the look in his eyes silenced her. Lillian fared worse. She woke crying, insisting that in her dreams something slithered above her, dragging itself across the ceiling. She begged not to sleep in her own room. Curling against her mother in bed, trembling until exhaustion claimed her, Maria found herself listening more closely. At first it was subtle, a faint stirring, as though the house breathed with them at night. But soon the sounds became undeniable. Heavy drags across the floorboards overhead, muffled thuds that reverberated through the ceiling, creaks that suggested something more deliberate than settling wood. In the silence of late hours, with her children asleep and Rex pacing the floor, the noises filled her with a dread she could not explain. The attic, long forgotten, had become a place of menace. Still, she ignored it. Denial was easier than action. The house already demanded too much: the broken gutter, the faulty stove, the mounting utility bills. She told herself that she could not afford to discover another problem, not when she barely managed the ones she already faced. She bought cheap mouse traps and scattered them around the baseboards, convincing herself this would solve everything. But every morning, the traps sat empty. The noises continued. Rex's agitation worsened, and his meals went untouched, as though his stomach was knotted with unease. Nights became longer. Maria lay awake, straining to hear whether the sounds had stopped, only for her heart to sink when the attic seemed to stir again. The children shifted restlessly in their rooms. Rex barked without warning, and Maria realized she had started to dread the very place she called home. She no longer trusted the silence above them. One night, the sounds grew so loud she could no longer pretend. She lay in bed, her eyes wide open in the dark, and felt it clearly. The ceiling above her seemed to tremble with weight, as though something massive moved directly over her head. The boards creaked, the plaster shuddered faintly, and she felt an unnatural vibration seep down into her bones. Her heart pounded against her ribs, and for a moment she thought she heard the faint hiss her son had described, drawn out and menacing. She clutched the blanket around her, too afraid to move, listening as Rex snarled at the attic door until his voice went hoarse. When morning came, Maria's face was gray with exhaustion, her eyes hollow. She knew she could not continue like this. Pretending it was nothing had only given the thing above them time to grow bolder. For the first time, she allowed herself to think not of mice, not of squirrels, but of something else entirely. Something that didn't belong in the rafters of her home. The fear coiled in her stomach, cold and heavy. She looked at her children as they ate their breakfast, their innocent chatter filling the kitchen, and she felt the weight of responsibility settle even heavier on her. Whatever was hiding above them was her burden to face. By the time the sun rose higher that day, she had made her decision. She would go up into the attic herself. It no longer mattered how tired she was, how afraid she felt, or how little she wanted to face whatever lurked there. She could not let another night pass under the shadow of those noises. For her children, for Rex, for herself, she would have to climb into that space of dust and shadows and confront the truth that waited. And so, the first chapter of Fear ended with a choice, a quiet resolve, born not of courage, but of necessity. Maria gathered her strength in silence, knowing that the house which had once been her reluctant shelter was about to reveal its darkest secret. The stillness of the day offered no comfort, only the certainty that when she pulled down the ladder and set foot on those creaking boards, her life would never again be the same. Morning light spilled through the narrow kitchen window, but it did little to ease the unease that had settled over Maria's heart. She moved through the familiar rhythm of preparing breakfast for her children. Yet every sound, the clink of plates, the scrape of chairs on the old wooden floor, the murmur of her children's voices, seemed distant, muffled under the heavy weight of her dread. She knew what awaited her once they left for school. For weeks, she had buried the problem under excuses, convincing herself that the house had always creaked, that her children exaggerated their fears, that Rex barked at shadows. But the long night had broken through her walls of denial. The sounds had grown too heavy, too deliberate, and the house itself had felt as though something alien pressed against its bones. As she watched Thomas slip his backpack over his shoulder and Lillian clutch her worn lunchbox, Maria smiled with effort she did not feel. Her children's eyes reflected both worry and trust. They had come to sense her unease, though she tried to hide it. And she saw in Thomas's glance the awareness that she was preparing herself for something. When they stepped out the door, the silence of the house closed around her like a shroud. Only Rex remained, pacing the hallway, his nails clicking against the floorboards, his gaze fixed toward the attic as though waiting for her to follow. She lingered only a moment, standing in the living room, staring at the pull-down ladder that led upward. Her stomach churned with fear. Every part of her wanted to leave the house and wait for the noises to reveal themselves to someone else, someone stronger. But she could not flee. Her children would return in the afternoon, and whatever was above them would still be there. She could not allow them to sleep another night beneath that weight. With trembling hands, she fetched the flashlight, pulled on an old pair of work gloves, and tucked the long kitchen knife into the waistband of her jeans. The gesture was almost absurd, yet it lent her a shred of courage. Rex whined at her side, his body taut with unease, as though he understood she was about to invite the very danger he had been warning her of. The creak of the ladder as she pulled it down echoed too loudly in the quiet house. Dust rained from the opening, filling her throat with a bitter taste. But she set her jaw and began the climb. Each step groaned beneath her weight, and she felt the air grow colder as she rose into the shadowed space above. Rex followed as far as he could, his paws scrabbling at the base of the ladder, his bark low and urgent. When her head breached the opening, Maria shone the flashlight into the darkness. The attic smelled of neglect. Dust and rot mingled with a sweet, cloying odor that made her stomach twist. She crawled onto the boards, the flashlight's beam slicing through the gloom, revealing broken insulation hanging in tatters, beams crisscrossed with cobwebs, and piles of debris that had collected over years of abandonment. But as she moved further in, the light caught something that froze her blood. On one of the rafters were long, deep gouges, as though something heavy had scraped its way across the wood. The marks were fresh, raw splinters jutting from the beams, and they told of strength far beyond what any rodent could possess. Beneath them, the insulation sagged unnaturally, bulging upward as if something large pressed from beneath. Maria crouched low, her pulse pounding in her ears as the flashlight revealed more unsettling evidence. Scattered feathers, clumps of fur, shredded pieces of plastic wrappers, all the refuse of some hidden nest. And through the dust on the floorboards ran broad, smooth trails, like lines carved by something massive dragging its body across the space. Rex growled from the opening below, his eyes fixed on the bulging insulation. Maria swallowed hard. She wanted to retreat, to pretend she had seen nothing. But she knew the truth would follow her. Her children slept just below this spot, oblivious, and she could not bear the thought of leaving them vulnerable. Summoning what little courage remained, she approached the swollen section of insulation. Her knees shook so violently, she feared they would buckle, and the beam of the flashlight quivered with her trembling hands. The bulge loomed before her like the belly of the house itself, straining against its confines, daring her to reveal what it concealed. She set the flashlight on a beam so that it illuminated the space, and reached out with her gloved hands. Her fingers brushed the warped panel, and she felt the dampness of rot beneath her touch. For an instant she almost turned back, but then, with a deep breath, she pressed her weight against the edge, prying at the loosened board. The wood resisted at first, clinging stubbornly, and then gave way with a crack. The moment it broke free, the attic erupted in chaos. Something heavy shifted above her, and before she could react, a mass crashed down with bone-rattling force. The flashlight toppled, rolling across the boards, its beams swinging wildly, and in that fractured light, Maria saw the horror that had been her unseen lodger. A body as thick as her thigh coiled upon itself, scales gleaming dully in the dust. The creature's length seemed endless, twisting across the attic floor, and as it reared its head, its eyes reflected the light with a cold, alien gleam. Maria's breath seized in her throat. A Burmese python, larger than anything she could have imagined, filled the confined space. Its muscles rippled beneath its patterned skin as it shifted, curling protectively around a mound in the corner. Her gaze followed the curve of its body, and then she saw them, pale, leathery eggs, each larger than her fist, nestled together in the wreckage of insulation. 20 or more, arranged with chilling precision. The snake's massive head hovered above them, tongue flickering, and Maria understood with paralyzing clarity that she had intruded upon a nest. For one suspended moment, she could not move. Terror held her frozen, her body trembling as though it no longer belonged to her. Rex barked furiously from below, his voice a desperate warning, but even his presence felt distant, muffled by the weight of fear that pressed upon her. The snake turned its gaze toward her, and in that cold, measuring stare, she felt the fragile boundary between hunter and prey collapse. Her heart thundered in her ears, each beat a violent drum against her ribs. She staggered backward, nearly tripping over the scattered debris. The attic seemed to close around her, shadows thickening, the air cloying with the scent of dust and scales. The python shifted, uncoiling slightly, its body moving with a slow inevitability that spoke of patience, of strength, of a predator that knew it did not need to hurry. Maria's hand brushed against the flashlight, and she seized it, clutching it like a weapon, though she knew it could do nothing against the massive creature. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, to put as much distance as possible between herself and the beast. But her limbs felt leaden, her lungs constricted by fear. She forced herself to take one step, then another, retreating toward the ladder, never taking her eyes off the snake. Rex's barking grew more frantic, his body a tense silhouette against the light from below. Maria finally broke free of her paralysis, stumbling toward the opening. The python hissed, a long, low sound that reverberated through the beams, and she nearly lost her balance in her scramble to escape. Somehow, she reached the edge of the attic, her breath ragged, her chest burning, and began the desperate descent. The last glimpse she caught before pulling herself down was of the python coiling tighter around its eggs, its massive body filling the corner like a dark, living weight pressing upon the house. The attic had revealed its secret, and in that revelation, Maria knew her life had shifted irrevocably. What she had dismissed as shadows and vermin had proven to be a danger greater than she could have imagined. Her feet touched the floor below, and Rex pressed against her, his body rigid, his eyes wide. Maria clutched his fur as though drawing strength from him, gasping for breath. Her heart still hammering with terror. The house no longer felt like a shelter but a trap, a cage that held within it a predator whose presence she could not ignore. For her children, for herself, for the fragile semblance of safety she clung to, she understood there could be no more denial. The attic had become a battlefield, and the danger that waited above was far from finished. Maria stumbled down the ladder with a desperation that made her nearly miss the last step, her body trembling so violently that she could barely keep her balance. Rex lunged forward, barking and circling her, as if to push her away from the attic door, his hackles raised, his teeth bared at the darkness above. She dragged the ladder up and slammed the trap closed with a strength she did not know she had, her breath rasping in her throat as if the very air had turned to smoke. The house, once only a weary shelter, now felt entirely possessed by the presence she had uncovered. Every creak of the beams seemed heavier, infused with menace, as though the snake's coils extended beyond the attic into every corner of the rooms below. She collapsed to her knees in the hallway, pressing her forehead against Rex's thick fur, the dog's warmth the only anchor keeping her from shattering completely. She had seen enough in that dim, dust-filled space to understand that this was no phantom of fear, no exaggeration from her children's restless dreams. The python had been living above them, incubating its brood, a silent danger poised over their heads each night they had slept in fragile innocence. The thought of her children, their small bodies unaware of the monstrous presence so close, filled her with a terror that clawed at her chest. She could not let them step foot in this house again, not until the invader was gone. Her first instinct was flight. She staggered to her feet, grabbed her bag from the counter, and fumbled with her phone. Her fingers were slick with sweat, trembling too hard to dial properly, but she managed to call the school, her voice hoarse as she told them she was coming to pick up her children early. She drove as though pursued, Rex panting heavily in the back seat, his eyes still wild. The image of the python's gleaming eyes, its coils pressed protectively around the mound of eggs, burned into her vision so vividly that she could hardly keep her focus on the road. When she arrived at the school, she pulled her children to her chest with such urgency that they cried out in confusion. They clung to her, frightened by her shaking, but she could not loosen her grip. Back at the house, she could not make herself go inside again. She parked at the curb and kept the children outside with her, their faces pale with worry as they watched her pace in agitation. Thomas asked what was wrong, but Maria could not bring herself to speak the truth. How could she tell her children that a predator large enough to crush them in its coils had been nesting above their heads all along? Instead, she promised only that they would not sleep in the house that night. They would stay with a friend, she said, and in her words, the children sensed enough urgency not to argue. The next call was to Wildlife Control. Her voice broke as she described what she had seen, every word tumbling out in a rush, as if speaking too slowly might allow the thing to escape and descend upon them before help could arrive. The operator on the other end was calm but firm, assuring her that a team would come quickly, that such intrusions were rare but not unheard of in Florida homes. Yet the assurance did little to ease the cold dread coursing through her. It was one thing to know that the experts were coming. It was another to sit on the curb with her children pressed close, knowing the monster still lurked inside. When the truck finally arrived, Maria felt both relief and horror twist inside her. Two men in heavy boots and thick gloves stepped out, carrying equipment that looked both inadequate and terrifyingly necessary. Long poles with clamps, reinforced bags, containers for eggs. She clutched her children close as the men asked her to remain outside. They moved with the steadiness of people who had faced such dangers before, yet even their confident manner could not fully mask the caution in their eyes when she told them of the size of the snake and the nest of eggs. Maria waited on the curb, every nerve stretched taut, as the men climbed into her house. The silence that followed was unbearable. She imagined them pushing open the attic hatch, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, revealing the coils that had nearly crushed her will to stand. She strained to hear anything, footsteps, voices, but the only sound was the faint rustle of leaves in the yard and the uneven breaths of her children. When the first thud echoed from inside, she flinched so hard that Lillian whimpered against her shoulder. Then came the heavy scrape of something dragging, a muffled shout, the sound of wood striking wood. Maria's imagination filled the gaps, and in her mind, she saw the serpent uncoiling, striking at the intruders, defending its brood with primal fury. The minutes stretched into an eternity. At last the door opened, and the men emerged. Their bodies tense as they maneuvered a massive, writhing shape encased within the clamps of their poles. The python's body spilled across the boards, as though endless, its muscles rippling with terrifying power, its head lunging in protest. The sight made Maria reel backward, clutching her children tighter. She realized then how much larger the snake was than she had understood from the attic's shadows. 12 feet of living muscle, thick as her arm in places, and strong enough to suffocate anything in its path. Behind them came another worker, carrying a container filled with the pale, leathery eggs. 20 in all, each a chilling reminder of how close the family had come to sharing their home with not one predator, but many. The man explained that the eggs would be destroyed, that the snake would be relocated to a facility where it could be kept safely away from homes. He spoke in calm, even tones, but Maria heard only the unspoken words. If not for Rex, if not for her decision that morning, her children might have been the prey the python awaited. When the specialists drove away, the house felt both empty and tainted. Maria could not bring herself to step inside immediately. She stood in the yard, her children huddled close, and gazed up at the windows that had once seemed tired but harmless. Now they looked like eyes, hollow and watchful, and she shuddered. The walls no longer held only memories of hardship, but the echo of danger. She knew she could not simply return as if nothing had happened. Something in her relationship to the house, to her own sense of safety, had irrevocably shifted. Over the following days, she arranged for repairs. A contractor came to install heavy metal mesh over every vent, every gap in the eaves. She replaced the flimsy insulation, demanded that every vulnerable seam of the roof be sealed. She poured money she did not have into the work, but she did it without hesitation, because the price of safety was one she could not ignore. The children stayed with a friend until she felt secure enough to bring them home again, and Rex never left her side, watching the workers with a seriousness that reminded her of how much they owed him. At night, when the house grew quiet again, Maria sat in the living room with her children, and Rex curled at her feet. The silence was different now. No longer did it carry the threat of hidden movement above. Instead, it hummed with the fragile relief of survival. Yet even in the calm, Maria felt a shadow inside her, a reminder of how close danger had come to stealing everything she loved. She understood now that ignoring fear did not banish it, that sometimes it took the form of scales and coils waiting just beyond sight. She would never again dismiss the instincts of her dog, never again silence the inner voice that warned of danger. She looked at her children, their faces softened by sleep, and at Rex, whose eyes still glimmered with watchfulness even in rest. Her family had endured what should never have been theirs to face, and though the house stood as it always had, its meaning had changed. It was no longer simply a burden of repairs and bills. It was a place they had fought to reclaim, a shelter they had nearly lost, but now guarded fiercely. Maria breathed deeply, letting the weight of the moment settle in her chest. And with it came a solemn vow. She would protect this fragile circle of life with every ounce of strength she had. She had faced the dark heart of her own home and survived, and that survival bound them closer than ever before. The python was gone, its nest destroyed, but the lesson it left behind would never fade. For Maria, the memory of that coiled body in the attic would remain a testament to vigilance, to the fragile thread that kept her family safe, and to the quiet heroism of facing fear when no one else could. And in the quiet hum of her reclaimed house, with Rex resting beside her and her children asleep in their rooms, she felt something she had not in years, a certainty that she could endure, no matter how dark the shadow pressing against the beams of her life. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Take a moment to watch the next video waiting for you right now. There are many more stories to discover. And don't forget to share this video with friends and family. Some stories are too important to keep to yourself.